Good morning, welcome, hope you're doing well. Happy Sunday. We're nearly there, 5 days till Christmas, exciting times. Welcome to Speaker's Corner, a famous landmark in Hyde Park where people have come for many years to debate, to talk about things that they feel passionately about, to argue, to disagree, of course. To seek to find out the truth together. Things, friends, that are worth having are worth pursuing, and Speaker's Corner represents those things that are worth pursuing. People, whether of faith or of other belief systems, or scientists, I guess, as well, come here to debate ideas. Things that are worth having are worth pursuing. This morning, I want to speak with you about faith, the pursuit of faith. There's a great deal of mystery and, I'm afraid, misinformation about faith. Some people think that faith is a sort of magical thing that kind of appears from nowhere, and there is some truth in that. But faith is more predictable than that. Last week we were thinking about the evidence for the Christian faith. And certainly, in order to have faith, you have to come to that evidence. You have to weigh that evidence. You have to be touched by that evidence. You have to think about it, wrestle with it, agree with it or disagree with it, but engage with it. Much like here at Speaker's Corner, here is a place of engagement with ideas. Sometimes people say to me, "I wish I had your faith." That's a lovely thing to say. But behind that phrase, that sentence, there can be a whole multitude of things. There can be a sense of passivism. I wish I had your faith, but I'm never going to get it. And you have faith, I don't. So there can be a sort of defeatist notion behind that. And that makes me sad, because I think if you want to have faith, faith is available to be pursued, to be found, and to be lived through. Sometimes people say, "I want to have your faith," but actually, and there's much more a real sense that they just need to be told about it, and then they will find it for themselves. So this morning I want to do three things. I want to look at the barriers to faith. There are certain inevitable barriers that people come up against when it comes to faith. I want to look at the barriers. Then I want to look at the conditions for faith. What helps faith to grow? And then finally I want to look at a case study as we see a man in the Bible come to Jesus with some faith, and by the end of the story seems to have more. So let's think firstly about the barriers to faith. What are those barriers to faith? Well, firstly, misinformation. There are many people who just have no real understanding of what the Christian faith is about. They may have had an experience or one or two experiences in a church, but essentially they are ignorant. There is a lack of information, and to them faith is just something over there. I guess it's like all those things we don't really understand. You ask me about a knitting. I don't really understand about knitting. It's a mystery to me. Of course, if I investigated it, bought myself some wool and some knitting needles and watched a few YouTube videos, I guess I could start out in a career of knitting. But at the moment, knitting to me is just a mystery, and for many people faith is the same. But worse than that, because for many people there is a sort of shard of understanding which is actually wrong, and they hold that shard of understanding, and that keeps them away from real faith. So there is misinformation. Secondly, there is upbringing. So some people's upbringing really mitigates against them establishing a faith. Some of you watching this may have gone to a boarding school or a private school, and you will have sat potentially in chapel maybe every day of the week, and you will have sat there, and so often your upbringing of faith was that experience. And for many people I've spoken to, well-meaning as it may be in those schools to have chapel every day, for many people I've spoken to, they say, well, I simply sat there counting the bricks in the chapel or staring into the abyss as things were going on up the front. And so in that sense, that experience, that upbringing experience can put people off faith for decades, tragically even their whole life. And then of course what our parents think has an enormous impact on how we come to the question of faith. I mean, if our parents are people of faith, then we're at least likely to look into some of the claims. And if they're not, then we're less likely, because of course our parents have a profound and shaping influence on us. So upbringing can have a very positive effect, but also quite a very negative effect on faith. It isn't true that just because your parents are Christian, you are a Christian, but it is true that you may well have been taken to church and you will have been exposed to the things of the Christian faith, and that may well give you a head start. So upbringing can be a barrier to faith. Then I've mentioned it already, but the church can be a glorious place full of life and love, but it can also be a boring and irrelevant place. Full of people doing things somewhere else, full of so-called mystery, but mystery that is baffling. It can, alas, of course, be full of hypocrisy as well. And some people have said to me over the years, well, I just can't deal with the church. And their experience of church has just been negative. Now, whether that's a fair comment or not, I can't myself comment. But you will know people, and I will know people, who have come into contact with the church, and for whatever reason, the church has become a barrier to their faith. I want to say again, though, that church at its best is wonderful. So I'm not just going to knock the church, and I'm not going to give it as the only reason that people don't have faith. But sometimes, alas, of course, the church is a fallible organisation, and sometimes, of course, it lets down the Christian faith. Then there are two final barriers. The first is a fear of rejection. Some people have experienced great rejection in their lives, either from friends or parents or colleagues, and they think, well, if I come to the Christian faith, I'm just going to find rejection. And of course, if that is your suspicion, then why on earth are you going to seek after something like faith if you just think it's going to reject and condemn you? So there is a fear amongst some of rejection. Then the other thing that is a barrier to faith is those people who don't see any need for it. They say to me, look, I've got my life. Why do I need faith? What's faith got to offer me? And that can so often be a barrier. And certainly prior to this year, there were many people who just were carrying on with life quite carefree. But this year has actually presented an opportunity to us. Because as we've had all these horrible things come to us in this era of COVID, so we've had to ask ourselves some really quite profound questions about what our lives are about, and indeed where we are building our lives. So although COVID has been a really, really tough year, it's also been an opportunity, particularly for those who say, well, I don't really see any need of this. I want to say to you this morning, you need faith much more than you realise. And when you find it, you will wonder how you ever lived without it. So those are those 5 barriers to faith. And I wonder, it's quite possible that you can resonate with one or two of those barriers. You think, yeah, that has stood in my way. And yeah, that is a problem for me. Well, I want to say to you, knock down those barriers. Because faith doesn't just appear. There are things that stand in its path, and we are called as people to look at the barriers, to analyse them, and then to knock them down. So knock down those barriers. Secondly, what are the conditions then for faith to grow? As you know, I'm quite a bread maker, and I like to make sourdough bread. And in order to make sourdough bread, you have to start the night before with your starter. Well, in fact, you have to start way before that. You have to make the starter, and that takes a week. But assuming you've got a starter which is full of yeast, you then have to get the starter out of the fridge, put some more fresh flour and water in it, and leave it overnight to let it re-energize. You then take that starter on the morning that you're going to be mixing your bread. You add the flour, you add more water, you add some salt, and you leave it to prove pretty much for most of the day. Then you put it in the fridge, leave it overnight, and then you bake it in the morning. So from start to finish, to make a sourdough loaf of bread takes at least 24 hours. And if you add in the starter making, it takes a week and 24 hours. It's a very slow process. Friends, faith takes time to grow. Like bread, it has to be proved. It needs the right conditions to grow. And one thing it certainly needs is time. You can't rush faith. I can't give you a jab and say, there you are, there's faith. No, you have to work at it. Anything worth pursuing takes time, and faith is worth pursuing, so it takes time. So yes, you need time. Secondly, faith, though needing to be pursued is also a gift of God. This is where the two seem to stand in paradox to each other. You ask, well, which is it? Does it need to be pursued or is it given? The answer is it's both. So yes, pursue it, but also we have to ask for it. We have to stop and we have to call upon God and say, God, please, will you give me faith in you? Of course, to do that, in one sense, is an act of faith, and also it's a risk. Another way to think about faith is to use the word risk. There is risk involved in faith. But we have to ask God, help us to see you. God, help us to believe in you. God, give me that gift of faith. Give me sight so that I can see the reality of the world in which I am living. So yes, faith takes time, but also faith has to be asked for. We have to pray, we have to humble ourselves and say, look, I can't just find this by my hard work. I've got to ask God for it. The third thing that faith loves is to be communal. So sometimes people say, well, my faith is a private matter. And I understand that faith is a very private matter, but it can't only be a private matter. Faith is given to be expressed with other people of faith. It's much like anything really. If you want to do anything well or better, it normally requires you to come into contact with other people trying to do it well or better. Take running. Okay, it's fine to run on your own, but when you run with somebody else, you tend to run better and faster. It tends to be easier. Likewise with faith. Faith isn't given us and pursued by us just to be hoarded for us, a sort of personal treasure that we carry within us. Faith is to be brought with others of faith. That is really what the church is. It's not a building. It's people of faith gathering together to worship the God who has given them faith. And so coming to church isn't simply a matter of ritual. It's a matter of re-establishing and encouraging the faith that we each have. And we all have different measures of faith. We all express it slightly differently. But it is wonderful to come together, which is why when people say, oh, well, I'm a spiritual person, but I don't go to church, or I'm a Christian, but I'm not really a churchgoer. Friends, I don't understand that. Because we need each other of faith. We need your faith, you need ours. And God has created the church not just for buildings and ritual and institutions. God has created the church to be his people coming together to grow in faith. And when you come to the church and you hear of the Christian faith and you meet with others who share your faith, of course, you are meant to leave encouraged. It encourages your faith. So faith must be communal. And that is one of the key conditions for faith to grow. And it also has to be expressed. Expression deepens impression. So when you express your faith, it helps you to believe it's real. A bit like anything really. I mean, I can wax lyrical about something I can do, but when I actually do it, it reinforces what I've been talking about. Likewise with faith. Faith loves to be expressed because when faith is expressed, it is reinforced in our souls and we start to believe it even more. A bit like with marriage. You know, of course I'm married to Liz and I love my wife. But when I do things to express that love, it reinforces the love. You know, I buy her some flowers or I cook her a meal. And I do those things, by the way, sometimes. It reinforces that sense, yeah, I really do love my wife. So faith is communal, and the conditions for faith is communal, but also it must be expressed. It's not something private to be hoarded in our soul and smuggled into heaven. Faith is a gift given to us to bless others and to be used in community. So those are some of the conditions that mean faith in Jesus Christ grows. But now finally I want to look at one example, and it's an example of a man called Nicodemus. And Nicodemus we come across in John chapter 3. He comes to Jesus at night, we're told. And there's a real sense he comes at night because he's a bit frightened, he's a bit timid. He's a religious leader. And of course Jesus and the religious leaders didn't get on. They would be friends here at Speaker's Corner, arguing with one another. And Nicodemus is one of the religious leaders in a group of people who don't get on with Jesus, except that he sees something in Jesus that he knows is real and genuine, is true. So he comes to Jesus at night and he says to Jesus, look, Jesus, I know you're a good teacher. I know that you can do amazing miracles. And Jesus looks at him and says, you've got to be born from above, Nicodemus. And he starts talking to Nicodemus all about the wonderful things that he needs to touch his life from a heavenly place, from a spiritual and heavenly place. And so that's the conversation. It's in John chapter 3. I commend it to you. In that chapter, we have the most famous verse in the Bible. God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever should believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That most famous verse in the Bible comes just after Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus. Anyway, there's Nicodemus, chapter 3 of John's Gospel. We don't hear about him again until John chapter 19, and Jesus has died. And Joseph of Arimathea, who is also a very prominent religious leader, comes to Pilate and asks for the body. And Nicodemus, we find, who we haven't heard anything about since John chapter 3, Nicodemus is there. And so what we find is this in John chapter 19. Joseph was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 35 kilograms. And I love that reference to Nicodemus. There's a sense that although we've heard nothing about him since John chapter 3, he comes now much more in the open with his friend Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, and he comes with Joseph to anoint the body. 35 kilos of myrrh, that's an awful lot of perfume and anointing oil. And I like to think that in the section between John chapter 3 and John chapter 19, Nicodemus grows in faith. He comes to Jesus with his questions at night, and as he investigates further, as the conditions of faith improve, so we find by the end of John's Gospel, he's a man expressing his faith. He's a man in community with at least Joseph of Arimathea. He's doing things that are costly because of his faith. He's anointing the most precious body the world has ever known. So friends, faith, things that are worth having are worth pursuing. Pursue the things of faith. Wrestle with them, argue, think about, seek God. Even if you don't really believe in God, what have you got to lose? Throw up a prayer. Dear Lord, if you're there, give me faith. Or, dear Lord, increase my faith. Some of you watching here will have a strong Christian faith. Keep nurturing it. Remember the bread. Keep letting it prove. Keep aerating it so that it grows and grows. Friends, the most important thing that we will have at the end of our lives is faith or no faith. The most important thing we will have is faith or no faith, because that's the thing that God is going to look at us and say, do you know me? Do you love me? Do you follow me? All the other stuff may be evidence for that, but in the end, the crunch question is, does God know us? Do we believe in him? If we don't believe in God, why should he really believe in us? Things that are worth having are worth pursuing. Pursue faith. It's wonderful. It's air to the soul. It's certainty of where you're going. It's peace in the midst of a pandemic. Faith is the most wonderful thing. Knock down the barriers and do those things that encourage your faith even today. May God bless you richly.